Chinese Civil War. The Chinese Civil War, which tore through the country from 1927 to 1949, was an all-out brutal conflict that left nothing but devastation in its wake. On one side stood Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party, the ruling government trying to hold the country together. On the other were Mao Zedong's communist forces determined to tear it all down and rebuild China from the ground up. The war unfolded in two major phases. The first ran from 1927 to 1937, but everything hit pause when Japan invaded during World War II, forcing both sides into an uneasy alliance. However, the moment Japan surrendered in 1945, the truce collapsed, and the nationalists and communists went right back to slaughtering each other, this time with even more fury than before. An estimated 8 million soldiers died in combat, but the civilian deaths were even worse. Between 5 and 8 million people perished due to violence, famine, and disease. All in all, the war claimed as many as 16 million lives, making it one of the deadliest conflicts in all of human history. Both sides were horrendously brutal. The communists would enter towns and murder landowners outright as part of their land reform. Yet the nationalists were just as vicious. In 1938, they made a desperate move. They blew up the dikes of the Yellow River to halt the Japanese advance, which resulted in massive flooding that swallowed over 20,000 square miles and killed hundreds of thousands of their own people. By 1949, Mao Zedong and his communist forces had come out on top, crushing the nationalists and seizing complete control of China. Chiang and 2 million of his supporters were forced to flee to the island of Taiwan. They set up their own government and announced they were still the legitimate rulers of China. This split created two Chinas that exist to this day. Mainland China still claims Taiwan as its own, but Taiwan operates as an independent country. This civil war is technically a ticking time bomb that could still erupt into an even larger war today, more than 70 years after the main hostilities ended. Russian Civil War. The Russian Civil War broke out right after the 1917 revolution and dragged on until 1922, and it was absolute mayhem. On one side were the Bolsheviks, known as the Reds, fresh off toppling the Tsar and dead set on building a communist state. Opposing them was the White Army, a messy coalition of monarchists, liberals, and basically anyone who hated the idea of communism. But it didn't stop there. Things got even messier. This wasn't just a two-sided war. Anarchist groups, independence movements, and foreign powers all jumped into the chaos. In total, 14 countries, including the US, Britain, and Japan, sent troops into Russia. But why? Because they were terrified communism might spill beyond Russia's borders, so they threw their weight behind the whites in hopes of putting the red threat down early. The level of brutality was off the charts. Both sides made use of mass executions and concentration camps. The Bolsheviks had their Red Terror campaign, in which they murdered anybody who they suspected of being against them. The whites were not much different with their White Terror, which basically had the same concept. And then came the famine of 1921 to 1922, when terrible harvests and war disruption murdered an estimated 5 million people. But what was the death toll from the Russian Civil War? Somewhere between 7 and 12 million, including those who starved during the chaos. That's more than the total number of Russians killed in all of World War I. By 1922, the Reds had somehow won despite being outnumbered and surrounded. They established the Soviet Union, uniting Russia with neighboring territories they'd conquered. The communist regime they created would dominate Eastern Europe and threaten the West for the next 70 years, fundamentally altering world history until the USSR's collapse in 1991. Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936 when a group of military officers led by General Francisco Franco staged a coup against the democratically elected Republican government. What followed was 3 years of savage warfare that turned Spain into a bloody testing ground for the global conflict that was just around the corner, World War II. It was the first major battleground between fascism and democracy. Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany provided guns, aircrafts, and thousands of volunteers to support Franco's nationalists. The Soviet Union backed the Republicans, sending weapons and advisors, while around 40,000 idealistic volunteers from all over the world formed the International Brigades, risking their lives to fight fascism head-on. Between 500,000 and 2 million Spaniards lost their lives, and tens of thousands more were driven into exile. But this is where things take an especially dark turn. Atrocities came from both camps, but Franco's forces stood out for their brutality, executing tens of thousands of civilians in the towns they seized. The Republicans also committed atrocities, as they targeted the church, killing thousands of priests and nuns they perceived as symbols of Franco's holy war. In April 1937, German planes fighting for Franco unleashed chaos on the Basque town of Guernica, marking the darkest moment. For 3 straight hours, they carpeted the town with explosives and incendiary bombs, turning civilians into targets. Hundreds died in what was essentially a live demonstration of Nazi Germany's terrifying new strategy of aerial warfare. By 1939, Franco's nationalists emerged victorious, establishing a fascist dictatorship that ruled Spain until his death in 1975. Franco's side ultimately won thanks to overwhelming military support from Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. They supplied cutting-edge weapons, aircrafts, and even troops, far surpassing the limited Soviet aid and the patchwork of international volunteers backing the Republicans. The nationalists' unified command and ruthless tactics also gave them an edge over the fractious Republican coalition, plagued by internal divisions between communists, anarchists, and moderates. The defeated Republicans faced brutal repercussions. Tens of thousands were executed, imprisoned, or forced into labor camps under Franco's regime. Many others, hundreds of thousands, fled into exile, primarily to France and Latin America, where they lived as refugees. Spain remained a dictatorship, isolated from much of the democratic world, until it transitioned to democracy in the late 1970s. Rwandan Civil War. The Rwandan Civil War might have had fewer deaths than some others on our list, but its sheer speed and savagery make it uniquely horrifying. The conflict ignited in 1990 when Tutsi rebels, known as the Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF, invaded from Uganda to challenge the Hutu-dominated government. For years, Rwanda simmered with tension. Sporadic violence and failed peace efforts only added fuel to the fire. Ethnic divisions ran deep, rooted in colonial favoritism that elevated the Tutsis, then flipped after independence when the Hutus took control. Decades of resentment built up, driving the country closer and closer to the edge. The crisis exploded on April 6, 1994, when a plane carrying the Hutu president was shot down, killing him. Within hours, Hutu extremists unleashed the fastest genocide in history. In just 100 days, 800,000 to 1 million people, mostly Tutsis and moderate Hutus who opposed the killings, were slaughtered. What made this civil war so brutal wasn't just the death toll, but how people were killed. While most modern wars use sophisticated weapons, the Rwandan genocide was carried out primarily with machetes, clubs, and farm tools. Neighbors killed neighbors. Teachers killed students. Even priests and nuns participated in killing people who had sought shelter in churches. The roots of this strife go back to the colonial period. The Germans and Belgians, who used to own this land, systematically favored the minority Tutsis over the majority Hutus, creating deep cleavages. With Rwandan independence, the roles were reversed, and decades of discrimination against Hutus turned into the Hutu power movement. The international reaction was complete failure. The United Nations actually withdrew most peacekeepers as the massacre got underway. World powers like the US refused to call it genocide to avoid legal obligations to intervene. French forces created a safe zone too late, letting many genocidaires escape to Congo. The Rwandan Patriotic Front rebels eventually halted the genocide by taking over the country. They established the Tutsi-dominated government that rules Rwanda to this day. Although Rwanda has since been one of the most stable countries in Africa, the aftermath included massive refugee crises and years of conflict in the neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo that have cost millions more lives. American Civil War. The American Civil War might seem tame compared to some on this list, but don't be mistaken. It was the deadliest war in US history. Between 1861 and 1865, Americans slaughtered more of each other than they did in all other US conflicts combined. It kicked off when Southern states decided they'd rather leave the Union than accept Abraham Lincoln as president. They formed the Confederate States of America under Jefferson Davis, while Lincoln led the Union in a brutal struggle to keep the nation from splitting in two. At its core, the war was about slavery, the backbone of the Southern way of life. The South's entire economy depended on millions of enslaved people, and they were willing to tear the country apart to keep it that way. Yes, there were arguments over states' rights and economic tensions, but let's be clear, the primary right they were fighting for was the right to own other human beings. The death toll was staggering for its time. Somewhere between 620,000 and 750,000 soldiers died, along with tens of thousands of civilians. To put that in today's terms, it would be like losing 7 to 8 million Americans in a single war. That's how devastating the Civil War was for the country. What set this war apart was that it was the first truly modern war. Railroads moved entire armies across vast distances. Telegraphs zipped messages between commanders, and factories churned out weapons on an industrial scale. But while the technology had leapt forward, military strategy hadn't caught up. Generals were still using old-school Napoleonic tactics. Line up and charge, despite facing rifles and artillery that could kill from hundreds of yards away. That mismatch is what made battles like Antietam and Gettysburg so horrifyingly deadly. The Union won the American Civil War in 1865, preserving the United States and abolishing slavery. Superior resources, manpower, industry, and railroads overwhelmed the Confederacy, despite its early tactical victories. The Union's naval blockade and key victories like Gettysburg and Vicksburg crippled the South. The Confederacy eventually collapsed. Its army surrendered, its leaders were either captured or fled, and the brutal war came to an end. What followed was Reconstruction, an effort to rebuild the South and bring it back into the Union. But while the war ended, deep racial tensions didn't. They lingered, simmered, and in many ways continued to shape the nation for generations to come. Nigerian Civil War. The Biafran War, also known as the Nigerian Civil War, is a glaring omission from most Western textbooks, despite being one of the deadliest conflicts of the 20th century. From 1967 to 1970, between 1 and 3 million people lost their lives, but not mainly from combat. Most died slowly and painfully from starvation, as food was used as a weapon of war. This civil war began 7 years after Nigeria had separated from Britain, when the southeastern region of the country proclaimed itself as the Independent Republic of Biafra. The Igbo, one of the largest ethnic groups in Nigeria, led the secession following the deaths of thousands of Igbos during massacres across northern Nigeria. The ethnic tensions were complex. Nigeria is home to over 250 ethnic groups, but 3 of these groups dominate: the Hausa Fulani in the north, the Yoruba in the southwest, and the Igbo in the southeast. The multicultural people had been lumped together by the colonial British without strong consideration of differences. With the discovery of oil in the Igbo-dominated southeast, the resource then became a major driver of the conflict. What made the Biafran War especially horrific was the Nigerian government's chosen tactic: a total blockade. Biafra was cut off from the outside world. No food, no medicine, no essential supplies. It wasn't just a military strategy, it was a slow, deliberate method of starving a population into submission. Despite international media coverage and global outrage, foreign intervention remained minimal and mostly self-serving. France offered limited aid to Biafra, but major powers like Britain and the Soviet Union backed the Nigerian government, more concerned with protecting oil interests than preventing a humanitarian catastrophe. After 30 months of fighting and famine, Biafra capitulated in January 1970. The region was reabsorbed into Nigeria, and amazingly, there was no mass retaliation against the Igbo. Nigeria's administration announced a policy of no victor, no vanquished, and fought to rebuild the ruined land. Cambodian Civil War. The Cambodian Civil War raged from 1967 to 1975, sparked by frustration over corruption, inequality, and deepening poverty. Prince Sihanouk's government was seen as out of touch, favoring urban elites while rural communities were left to rot. That discontent drove many to support the communist Khmer Rouge, who promised to tear everything down and start fresh. The conflict escalated when the Khmer Rouge began attacking government forces, and things really spiraled once the US got involved. Obsessed with stopping communism in Vietnam, the US treated Cambodia as a sideshow, but a deadly one. Starting in 1969, American bombers relentlessly targeted Khmer Rouge and North Vietnamese hideouts across the Cambodian countryside. Thousands of civilians were killed, and instead of crushing the rebels, the campaign only fueled more anger and drove even more people into the arms of the Khmer Rouge. The US dropped more bombs on Cambodia than it did during all of World War II. Yes, more than what rained down on Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan combined. This staggering bombing campaign killed an estimated 150,000 civilians and left the country in ruins. For many traumatized survivors, the Khmer Rouge, once considered radical, now looked like the only force willing to stand up to the chaos, driving even more people into their ranks. By 1975, the Khmer Rouge under Pol Pot had seized control of Cambodia. Around 300,000 people had died in the Civil War itself, but that was just the beginning. What followed would become one of the most horrifying genocides of the 20th century. Even before they started killing people en masse, the Khmer Rouge initiated one of the most extreme social engineering experiments in human history. They declared it as Year Zero, aiming to rebuild Cambodian civilization from its foundations. They forcibly sent every big city into exile, driving millions of city residents into the rural areas with no food, medicine, or shelter. Their utopia? A pure agrarian nation with no money, no schooling, no religion, no kinship, but only loyalty to the state. Anyone who was connected with the former administration was executed outright. Next on the chopping block were the so-called intellectuals, a term the Khmer Rouge used with terrifying looseness. If you had an education, wore glasses, spoke a foreign language, or even just looked like you might be able to read, you were marked for death. In their twisted vision of a pure agrarian society, knowledge itself had become a crime. Under Pol Pot's brutal rule, between 1.5 and 2 million Cambodians were killed, shot, starved, worked to death, or left to die from untreated diseases. That meant up to a quarter of the entire population was wiped out in just 4 years. The term killing fields became synonymous with genocide as mass graves filled the countryside and Cambodia descended into one of the darkest chapters in human history. This nightmare only came to an end in 1979 when Communist Vietnam, of all nations, invaded Cambodia and toppled the Khmer Rouge. But here's where Cold War politics got truly bizarre. Despite knowing the horrors of Pol Pot's regime, both the United States and China continued to officially recognize the Khmer Rouge as Cambodia's legitimate government for years afterward, just because they didn't like Vietnam.